Okay, so we talked about the war side of the Standard of Ur, so we're going to move on to the peace side. What's called the peace side of the Standard of Ur. So the peace side, I'll change the slide here. This is the peace side. It portrays a banquet. So in the lowest band, they're carrying food and, animals with them that, they're probably going to end up eating. And then, the same thing goes for second register. But at the top, there's a king-like figure up here. He's larger than everyone else, and he's using, obviously that's using hierarchy of scale. He's larger than everyone else to show his importance. So they think it's a feast, and they think it's a celebration banquet after the victorious battle, which is, shown on the other side of the standard, the war side. But also, some people think that that's just the two sides are not actually related, that they're independent scenes that illustrate the two main purposes of the ruler, which are, a mighty warrior and also the leader that assures the bountifulness of the land in peacetime would be the peace side. So he's a warrior and he's also kind of a figurehead that's in place to assure fertility of the land and, those kinds of things. And the Standard of Ur is a really great early example of historical narrative. So after the Sumerians, the Akkadians end up taking over. They're way more war-oriented culture. And they had a different idea than the Sumerians. They believed that their rulers were really close to being gods and that they were very powerful. And many Akkadian rulers did portray themselves as gods. So that's how the Akkadians did differ from the Sumerians in that way, in that their rulers had a godlike status, whereas the Sumerians looked at the ruler as kind of in service to his people, somebody that communicated with the gods on their behalf, but ultimately, the ruler he was not a god. He was never portrayed as a god in Sumerian art. So this is an Akkadian piece here. It's called Head of an Akkadian Ruler, from the Temple of Ishtar, from Iraq, the area of Iraq, 2250 to 2200 BCE. And this is an Akkadian ruler. It was made out of copper, and it really does, embody the concept of absolute monarchy. It was originally part of a larger statue that was, knocked over when the Akkadians were taken over by a different culture eventually. You can see there's some signs of deliberate mutilation here in the eyes. His eyes were stabbed out and his head was knocked off and that kind of thing. But you can see with the sculpture there's a lot of pattern and texture. So like in the beard, a lot of repeating patterns and texture, and in the hair. So there's a lot of pattern and textures in Akkadian art. It's also the oldest hollow metal sculpture known, which is a production technique that required a lot of skill. So they were able to figure that out, the Akkadians were. So this is called the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, set up at Sippar, Iraq, 2254 to 2218 BCE. So this is also another, Akkadian piece. It's called, the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin. And it does also show that concept of absolute monarchy. So a stele is usually erected to commemorate like a historical event or someone's grave, typically, but this was probably just to kind of honor the fact that Naram-Sin was able to defeat his enemy in a battle here. So you can see he's kind of up here. They're using the hierarchy of scale. He has a two-horned helmet on, which signifies dignity or divinity. So we see that Akkadian, godlike status that rulers have. And this is the first representation of a king as a god in Mesopotamian art. You can see there's stars up here at the top where it kind of shows that, the stars are shining on him, his victory. And he's also the Naram-Sin, the leader, is at the top of the composition, and you can see, his enemies are dead and dying, and they have arrows in them, and I think these are some of his soldiers down here. And the one thing that's different about this piece is there's no registers in this piece. Typically, in most of the art we've been seeing, there's been horizontal bands that divide up the canvas or the composition, but this one does not have registers, which is kind of unique. And there's also a little bit of a background added in, like the mountain here, there's a tree here. So it gives you a sense of place, which is kind of new too, to add in the landscape aspect into the background. I'm going to keep going here. Okay, so the Ziggurat. So after the Akkadians, the Gutians defeated the Akkadians for a short time. And then the Sumerians actually united once more and then drove them out. So the Sumerians kind of had two separate areas when they were kind of in ruling Mesopotamia, really. So this is the Sumerians, they're kind of back. They call it the Neo-Sumerian state. And it was ruled by the kings of Ur. And this time period is called the Neo-Sumerian age, or the third dynasty of Ur. So as you can see with Mesopotamia, there's a lot of tribal war going on. So it seems like every couple hundred years or so, another culture will take over. And so there's a lot of overturning of empires. So this is the Neo-Sumerian monument that's made out of mud brick and bitumen, which is kind of an asphalt-like substance. And it's called the Ziggurat, and it was built by the founder of the third dynasty and finished by his son. So it took many years to build. And it is kind of the oldest preserved tiered temple platform. Ziggurats are always tiered. So there's three kind of ramp-like stairways, one here, and then one here, that kind of lead up to the top. And the temple would have been on top here, which I don't think it's there anymore. And one thing about the ziggurat, it's aligned to the cardinal points. So that's another important thing about a ziggurat. So this is first and foremost a temple in the Mesopotamia area. Ziggurat is basically a temple. So here is a piece. It's called Gudea Seated, and he's holding the plan of a temple. It's from Iraq, 2150 BCE, made of diorite. So this is considered a votive statue that was placed in a temple on behalf of Gudea. So Gudea, was the patron. He hired an artist to make this, and then, inscribed different prayers and different things on it to the gods. And then they placed it in a temple on Gudea's behalf. So Gudea did this a lot. There's more than a dozen or 24 statues of him. And most of them are made of diorite. And diorite it had to be imported, and it was really expensive, and it was really hard to carve. So the diorite was actually quite a precious material. And his statues stood in temples where they would render perpetual service to the gods on Gudea's behalf. And Gudea is a little bit different in that he went back to the Sumerian way in believing that rulers were actually servants. So he kind of rejected that Akkadian model that rulers were gods. So yeah, the Sumerians kind of believed that the ruler was an agent of the gods in service of his people, really. So many of the sculptures have inscriptions of prayers, like I mentioned earlier. But this one, he's holding a plan of a temple in his lap. His hands are clasped in prayer. And Gudea is famous for rebuilding many temples, and that's why, there's a temple plan in his lap. He's claimed to have been, quoted as saying that, he had many dreams and that the gods asked him to rebuild the temples. So he did, during his lifetime, rebuild a lot of temples. So eventually the Elamites ruled over the territory of Sumer. They take over. The city-state model came back into existence, and definitely the most famous was Babylon. And I think you guys probably maybe have heard of Babylon. It's usually mentioned in the Bible. And Hammurabi was Babylon's most powerful king. And he also is responsible for enacting a set of laws. And he's kind of the first one to have done this. Let's see. And they were kind of enacted more than 1,000 years before any other law code that we know of. So this was set up at Babylon in Iraq from 1780 BCE. It was found in Susa, Iran. It's made of basalt, so it's 7 feet 4 inches tall. So you can see at the top of the stele, there's kind of a depiction of the sun god and then Hammurabi, and they're in high relief, so they protrude from the background quite deeply. And Hammurabi is kind of raising his hand in respect to the sun god. And then the sun god is handing him a rod and a ring, which symbolizes authority. They're builder's tools, like so the measuring rod and the coiled rope. And they kind of symbolize the ruler's capacity to enforce social order and measure the people's lives. So to render judgment and enforce the laws of the land, basically. So it's kind of a representation of, the gods are allowing him to basically, come up with these laws and enforce them. And the god is wearing a headdress. It's only showing 4 pairs of the 8 horns, so this is true profile, done in true profile. And they also seem to be using foreshortening as well, which means, it's kind of a way of showing depth. So it shows a figure at an angle instead of totally frontally. And this is kind of a new visual convention. So the throne is also kind of at an angle. You can kind of see the front and part of the side. So they're kind of doing a couple different things with spatial recession here in this piece. That's kind of new. So the Hittites end up taking over the Babylonian Empire. And then they end up leaving, and then the Kassites take over. And then to the east of Babylon, there's a city called Elam, which is in present-day Iran. And this is where some discoveries were made that are pretty interesting. Keep going. So the statue of Queen Napirasu from the Ninhursag Temple, Susa, Iran, 1340 to 1300 BCE, and it's bronze and copper. And you can see it's been intentionally damaged, probably when they were taken over by another culture. So it's life-sized, and the subject was the wife of a really powerful Elamite king, and it weighs 4,000 pounds. So that's super unique. And another unique thing is that it has a solid bronze core, which is really hard to do, and it makes it really expensive because the cost of metal was obviously high at this point. And they did this on purpose. They wanted to make it really heavy so that no one was able to move it, basically. The queen wanted it to be permanent and unmovable. It's her votive offering to the gods. It's there on her behalf to honor the gods. So she wanted it to stay there. And there's even some inscription on her skirt that asks the god to protect the statue. And so this does fall into that votive tradition that we've seen for quite a while. She has some pretty soft, feminine shoulders and arms, and her hands are very detailed. And the hands crossed over the belly may represent fertility, which is the main role of the queen. She's supposed to kind of produce an heir for the king.